In the modern world, where the digital realm intertwines seamlessly with our daily lives, we find ourselves immersed in an invisible theatre, a grand stage upon which the art of persuasion plays out with extraordinary precision. Behind every screen we touch, every scroll we make, and every click we execute, there lies an intricate web of psychological mechanisms meticulously designed to influence our thoughts, emotions, and ultimately, our décision. This is the unseen architecture of digital persuasion. To understand how deeply this system affects us, we must begin by acknowledging a profound truth. Humans are not purely rational creatures. Our minds, while capable of astonishing feats of logic and creativity, are also governed by ancient instincts, biases, and emotional triggers that have been hardwired over millennia of evolution. The architects of digital persuasion exploit these psychological levers with surgical precision, transforming ordinary technology into powerful instruments of influence. Consider, for instance, the concept of intermittent reinforcement, a psychological principle that has its roots in the work of B.F. Skinner, a pioneering behavioral psychologist. Skinner discovered that when rewards are delivered unpredictably, the subject becomes far more engaged, often obsessively so, than if the rewards were consistent or predictable. This principle forms the backbone of countless digital experiences today, from the endless scroll of social media feeds to the randomized rewards in mobile gaming and the sporadic nature of notifications. When you refresh your Instagram feed and see a new like, a comment, or a message, your brain receives a small hit of dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward. Yet, because these rewards are unpredictable, you keep returning, scrolling, and engaging, hoping for the next gratifying hit. This cycle mimics the compulsive behavior seen in gambling, where slot machines capitalize on intermittent reinforcement to create addiction. But digital persuasion operates far beyond simple reward mechanisms. It taps into our deepest needs for social validation, belonging, and identity. Social media platforms, for instance, are not merely tools for communication. They are sophisticated ecosystems designed to cultivate and manipulate our social instincts. The number of followers, likes, and shares become proxies for social worth, subtly conditioning us to seek approval and conform to prevailing narratives. This craving for validation activates the brain's reward centers, creating a feedback loop that drives engagement and conformity. It fosters an environment where dissent is discouraged and popular opinions are amplified, regardless of their accuracy or merit. In this space, truth becomes malleable, shaped by the collective appetite for affirmation rather than objective reality. Moreover, the algorithms that govern these platforms do not operate with moral discernment. Their sole directive is to maximize engagement, often by promoting content that evokes strong emotional reactions, anger, fear, Outrage, or joy. These heightened emotions capture attention more effectively than neutral or balanced information, leading to a digital landscape saturated with extremism, sensationalism, and division. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once observed that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, the unsettling awareness of infinite choices, and the burden of personal responsibility. In the digital age, we are inundated with choices, information, and opinions at an unprecedented scale. This overload often leads to decision fatigue, making us more susceptible to cognitive shortcuts or heuristics that simplify complex decisions but leave us vulnerable to manipulation. For example, the bandwagon effect encourages us to adopt beliefs and behaviors simply because others do. When a video goes viral, when a post garners thousands of likes, or when a trending topic dominates the discourse, we are subtly nudged to align our perspectives with the perceived majority. This herd mentality dilutes critical thinking and fosters echo chambers where dissenting voices are drowned out, and nuanced debate is forsaken. In this environment, the architects of digital persuasion wield immense power, not through overt coercion, but through the subtle shaping of narratives, the curation of information, and the strategic triggering of emotional responses. They transform users into participants in a grand psychological experiment, one where the boundaries between autonomy and influence blur into ambiguity. The implications extend far beyond individual behavior. At a societal level, the pervasive influence of digital persuasion reshapes cultural norms, political landscapes, and even our collective consciousness. Elections are swayed, movements are galvanized, and ideologies are propagated, all within the engineered architecture of digital platforms. Take, for instance, the phenomenon of micro-targeted political advertising. By harvesting vast troves of personal data, our likes, searches, purchases, and social interactions algorithms can construct intricate psychological profiles. These profiles enable the delivery of highly personalized messages designed to exploit individual fears, hopes, and prejudices with chilling precision. This form of persuasion transcends traditional propaganda. It operates not by broadcasting uniform messages to the masses, but by whispering tailored narratives into the ears of millions, each crafted to resonate with the recipient's unique vulnerabilities. The result is a fragmented public discourse where citizens inhabit divergent realities, each reinforced by algorithms that serve them content aligned with their predispositions. Philosopher Michel Foucault spoke of biopower, the control of populations through subtle mechanisms of influence and surveillance. In the digital age, we witness a new manifestation of biopower, where control is exerted not through overt oppression, but through the manipulation of information flows, the engineering of attention, and the commodification of our cognitive landscapes. Yet, perhaps the most insidious aspect of digital persuasion lies in its invisibility. Unlike traditional forms of manipulation, which often rely on recognizable authority figures or explicit messaging, digital persuasion operates behind the scenes, embedded within the algorithms, interfaces, and designs that structure our online experiences. Its influence is so pervasive, so seamlessly integrated, that we often remain unaware of its presence, mistaking manipulation for personal choice. As we stand at the crossroads of this digital epoch, we must confront a sobering question: to what extent are our thoughts, beliefs, and decisions truly our own? And if the answer reveals a disturbing degree of external influence, how do we reclaim our cognitive sovereignty in a world increasingly designed to capture and control our minds? This inquiry is not merely academic, it is a call to vigilance, to critical awareness, and to the cultivation of mental resilience in the face of unseen forces. For, in the theatre of digital persuasion, the price of ignorance is not merely personal, it is the erosion of autonomy, the fragmentation of society, and the perilous drift toward a world where freedom is an illusion cloaked in the seductive glow of our screens. To further grasp the depths of digital persuasion, we must peel back yet another layer, the subtle interplay between technology and human psychology that shapes our daily reality. The true genius of modern digital architects lies not in the technology itself, but in their profound understanding of the human condition, our fears, or désir, our cognitive shortcuts, they do not simply build platforms, they build experiences calibrated to manipulate the primal machinery of our minds. At the heart of this manipulation is attention. In the digital economy, attention is the currency. Every second you spend on a platform, every click you make, every scroll you perform, représente potentiel revenu. Advertising dollars flow directly in proportion to your engagement. The longer you stay, the more data you generate. The more data you generate, the more accurately you can be targeted. Thus, your attention becomes both the product and the prize. This is why platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube employ sophisticated techniques to keep you engaged. Autoplay ensures you don't need to make an active choice to consume the next video. Infinite scroll eliminates the natural stopping points that once allowed us to disengage. Notifications are engineered with precision timing to capture your attention when you are most vulnerable. These design choices are not accidental. They are the result of careful experimentation rooted in behavioral psychology. The Zeigarnik effect, for example, tells us that people remember uncompleted tasks better than completed ones. This is why cliffhangers, countdowns, and unresolved narratives are so effective in keeping users engaged. The feeling of incompletion gnaws at us, compelling us to return in search of closure. Social media exploits this effect masterfully, offering just enough information to keep us curious, but rarely enough to satisfy us completely. Then there's the fear of missing out. FOMO, a powerful driver of engagement. The constant stream of updates, trends, and viral content creates a perpetual anxiety that if we are not constantly connected, we might miss something crucial, something everyone else knows but we don't. This fear manipulates our behavior, compelling us to check our devices obsessively, often without conscious intent. But attention alone is not sufficient. To truly exert control, digital platforms must shape our beliefs, preferences, and behaviors. This is where confirmation bias enters the equation. Our brains are naturally inclined to seek information that confirms our existing beliefs and to dismiss information that challenges them. Algorithms capitalize on this tendency by curating content that aligns with our preferences, creating personalized echo chambers where dissenting views are systematically filtered out. Over time, this reinforcement of existing beliefs deepens our convictions, making us more polarized, more resistant to alternative perspectives, and more vulnerable to manipulation. The danger here is not merely individual, but collective. Entire societies become fragmented into ideological silos, each convinced of its own infallibility, each blind to the humanity of the other. Consider how misinformation spreads within these environments. A false narrative, once introduced into a tightly knit echo chamber, can spread like wildfire, amplified by algorithms that reward engagement regardless of accuracy. The viral nature of outrage ensures that the most emotionally charged and often the least truthful content receives the most visibility. The boundaries between truth and falsehood blur, not through censorship, but through overwhelming noise. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned of the dangers of a society where truth becomes irrelevant, where the distinction between fact and fiction collapses into indifference. In such a world, power does not rest on controlling reality, but on controlling perception. Digital persuasion accelerates this collapse, eroding our collective ability to discern what is real. Beyond the manipulation of information lies the commodification of identity itself. In the digital realm, we are not simply users, we are data points, complex profiles composed of our preferences, habits, interactions, and relationships. This data is harvested, analyzed, and sold to advertisers, political operatives, and corporations seeking to influence our choices. This phenomenon has given rise to what philosopher Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, an economic system built on the extraction and monetization of personal data. In this system, our most intimate behaviors, our fears, insecurities, and aspirations become valuable assets to be exploited for profit. We are mapped, predicted, and nudged toward decisions that serve the interests of those who control the data. Consider the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where personal data harvested from millions of Facebook users was weaponized to manipulate political outcomes. Micro-targeted advertisements exploited individual psychological vulnerabilities, subtly steering voting behavior without the knowledge or consent of those being influenced. This was not hacking in the traditional sense, it was psychological warfare conducted in plain sight. Yet, even this example represents only the tip of the iceberg. As artificial intelligence and machine learning advance, the capacity to model and predict human behavior becomes ever more precise. Predictive algorithms can anticipate not only what you want to buy, but what you are likely to think, feel, and believe tomorrow. The line between persuasion and preemption dissolves. The ethical implications are staggering. What does autonomy mean in a world where our choices are anticipated and shaped before we are even aware of them? What becomes of free will when algorithms can subtly steer our desires and perceptions without our conscious awareness? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the central dilemmas of our digital age. Moreover, the psychological toll of constant digital engagement cannot be ignored. Studies have linked excessive social media use to increased rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and low self-esteem, particularly among younger generations. The curated perfection of online personas fosters unrealistic comparisons, eroding self-worth and fueling a perpetual cycle of dissatisfaction. Jean Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality becomes eerily relevant here. In hyperreality, representations of reality become more real than reality itself. The polished images, filtered experiences, and algorithmically curated narratives we encounter online construct a parallel world that often bears little resemblance to the messy complexity of actual life. We begin to measure our worth not by genuine experience, but by the manufactured standards of digital perfection. Yet, amidst this bleak portrait, there lies an uncomfortable truth. We are not passive victims of digital persuasion. We are complicit participants. We trade our data for convenience, our privacy for personalization, and our attention for entertainment. The seductive allure of constant connection blinds us to the costs we incur. Like Faust, we strike a bargain, often without fully comprehending the price. This complicity does not absolve the architects of digital persuasion of responsibility, but it does demand introspection. To resist manipulation, we must cultivate awareness not only of the external forces acting upon us, but of our own susceptibilities, désir, and cognitive blind spots. True freedom in the digital age requires not isolation, but conscious engagement, a mastery of the self within the storm of influence. As we navigate this landscape, the question remains, can we reclaim our agency in a world designed to capture and commodify our minds? Or will we surrender, bit by bit, to an invisible system that shapes our reality while convincing us we are in control? To fully appreciate the magnitude of digital persuasion, we must examine not only its mechanics, but its origins. The current digital environment did not emerge by accident. It is the result of deliberate design choices informed by decades of psychological research, economic incentives, and technological innovation. Behind every interface, every recommendation algorithm, and every notification lies a legacy of behavioral science, meticulously applied to maximize engagement and control. In the mid-20th century, researchers like B. F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, and John Watson laid the foundations of behavioral psychology. Their experiments revealed the predictable ways in which organisms, including humans, respond to stimuli and reinforcement. These insights, initially developed for laboratory experiments, have since been industrialized and embedded into the very fabric of digital platforms. The Silicon Valley ethos absorbed these principles with remarkable enthusiasm. Tech entrepreneur, backed by venture capital and driven by the insatiable pursuit of growth, began building products not simply to serve user needs, but to capture and monetize attention. They recruited behavioral scientists, neuroscientists, and designers to engineer experiences that would be irresistible, addictive, and, above all, profitable. One of the most emblematic examples of this is the concept of gamification. Borrowed from the world of video games, gamification applies game-like mechanics to non-game contexts, transforming mundane activities into engaging, rewarding experiences. Points, badges, levels, leaderboards, and progress bars are all designed to trigger the brain's reward systems, fostering a sense of achievement and encouraging continued engagement. Apps like Duolingo, Fitbit, and LinkedIn employ these mechanics to keep users invested. But while gamification can be used to promote beneficial behaviors, such as learning or exercise, it can just as easily be weaponized to foster compulsive usage patterns, maximizing data extraction and monetization. Consider Snapchat's streak feature, a simple counter that tracks how many consecutive days two users have exchanged messages. On the surface, it appears innocuous, even playful. Yet beneath this design lies a potent psychological hook that exploits our fear of loss. Known as loss aversion, breaking a streak feels like a failure, driving users to maintain their engagement out of obligation rather than genuine desire. Similarly, platforms like Facebook and Instagram leverage social reciprocity, the unspoken obligation to return favors and acknowledgement. When someone likes your post or comments on your photo, you feel compelled to respond, perpetuating a cycle of interaction that feeds the platform's engagement metrics. But digital persuasion extends even deeper, penetrating into the realm of identity formation and self-concept. The profiles we curate, the content we share, and the personas we project online become extensions of our self-image. In seeking validation through likes, shares, and comments, we anchor our sense of worth to the approval of others, rendering us increasingly dependent on external affirmation. This dynamic echoes the insights of sociologist Charles Horton Cooley, who introduced the concept of the looking-glass self, the idea that our self-concept is shaped by how we believe others perceive us. In the digital age, the looking glass has become omnipresent, reflecting back to us a curated, algorithmically amplified version of our social standing. This endless mirroring fosters both narcissism and insecurity, driving ever deeper engagement in pursuit of elusive validation. As our identities become entwined with digital platforms, the distinction between authentic self-expression and performative curation blurs. We begin to optimize our behavior for the algorithm, crafting content that is more likely to garner attention, even if it means sacrificing authenticity. The pursuit of virality replaces genuine connection, and the metrics of engagement become proxies for personal success. At the societal level, this pervasive performativity fuels a culture of superficiality where appearance eclipses substance, and the loudest voices drown out the most thoughtful ones. Complex issues are reduced to sound bites, and nuanced debates are abandoned in favor of emotionally charged spectacles that drive clicks, shares, and outrage. The philosopher Marshall McLuhan famously observed that the medium is the message. In the digital age, the mediums we inhabit shape not only how we communicate, but how we think, feel, and relate to one another. The architecture of digital persuasion molds our cognitive habits, encouraging immediacy over reflection, reaction over contemplation, and consumption over creation. This cognitive reprogramming has profound implications for our ability to engage in critical thinking and meaningful discourse. As attention spans shrink and the velocity of information accelerates, the space for thoughtful deliberation contracts. We become conditioned to expect instant gratification, making the slow, deliberate work of reasoning and analysis increasingly alien. Furthermore, the constant influx of information fosters a state of continuous partial attention, a cognitive state in which we are never fully focused on any one task, but are perpetually scanning for new stimuli. This fragmented attention undermines our capacity for deep work, creativity, and sustained concentration, eroding the mental faculties essential for personal mastery and societal progress. In this environment, the cultivation of mental sovereignty becomes a radical act. To reclaim control over our minds, we must develop practices that counteract the manipulative designs of digital persuasion. This requires conscious effort, discipline, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable realities of our own susceptibility. One such practice is the deliberate cultivation of media literacy, the ability to critically evaluate information, recognize biases, and discern credible sources from manipulation. Media literacy empowers us to navigate the digital landscape with discernment, reducing our vulnerability to misinformation and emotional manipulation. Equally important is the practice of mindful consumption, the intentional curation of our digital environments to prioritize content that fosters growth, understanding, and meaningful connection. By choosing quality over quantity, depth over breadth, and substance over spectacle, we resist the algorithms that seek to hijack our attention. Moreover, we must cultivate psychological resilience, the inner strength to withstand the pressures of social comparison, to remain grounded in our values, and to resist the pull of performative validation. This resilience allows us to engage authentically, even in a digital world that rewards conformity and spectacle. The Stoic philosophers of antiquity offer timeless wisdom for navigating these challenges. Figures like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus taught the importance of focusing on what is within our control, cultivating inner virtue, and remaining indifferent to the judgments of others. In the face of digital persuasion, their teachings offer a path to reclaiming autonomy and integrity. Yet, while individual practices are essential, they are not sufficient. The systemic nature of digital persuasion demands collective action, a reimagining of the ethical frameworks, regulatory structures, and technological designs that govern the digital ecosystem. Without such reforms, the asymmetry of power between platforms and users will continue to grow, deepening the manipulation and eroding the foundations of democratic society. The stakes are high, for at the heart of this struggle lies the future of human freedom. Will we become passive subjects in a system that shapes our thoughts and behaviors for profit, or will we rise to the challenge, forging a new digital ethic that honors human dignity, autonomy, and the pursuit of truth, as we venture deeper into the heart of digital persuasion, we confront an unsettling paradox. The very technologies that promise to connect, inform, and empower us have also become sophisticated tools for division, confusion, and control. This is not the result of malevolent conspiracies alone, it is the consequence of a systemic dynamic where profit incentives, technological capabilities, and human psychology intersect. At the core of this dynamic lies algorithmic amplification, the process by which algorithms prioritize and promote content based on its ability to capture attention and drive engagement. Unlike human editors, algorithms operate without context, nuance, or moral consideration. They are indifferent to truth, wisdom, or the common good. Their sole directive is to optimize for engagement, and in doing so, they often elevate the most extreme, sensational, and polarizing content. This process fosters what political scientist Cass Sunstein describes as information cascades. As certain narratives gain visibility and traction, others are marginalized, creating self-reinforcing cycles of belief. People exposed to these dominant narratives, particularly in echo chambers, are more likely to adopt and propagate them, further amplifying their reach. In this way, algorithms shape public discourse, not through conscious censorship, but through the invisible mechanics of attention economics. The consequences of this are profound. Public debate becomes increasingly polarized. As individuals inhabit fragmented realities shaped by divergent information streams, complex issues are reduced to binary conflicts, stripping away nuance and fostering hostility. Empathy erodes as opposing viewpoints are caricatured and demonized. The digital commons, once envisioned as a space for democratic dialogue, devolves into a battlefield of competing tribes. In this climate, outrage culture thrives. Outrage, with its potent mix of moral indignation and emotional intensity, is a powerful driver of engagement. Platforms capitalize on this by surfacing content that provokes anger, fear, and moral judgment. Knowing that such emotions are highly contagious and effective at sustaining user attention, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once warned that he who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. In the digital arena, the perpetual outrage cycle transforms participants into warriors in an endless moral crusade, each convinced of their righteousness, each blind to their own susceptibility to manipulation. Yet, digital persuasion does not merely shape our collective discourse, it infiltrates the most intimate dimensions of our personal lives. Consider the phenomenon of predictive personalization, the ability of platforms to anticipate our preferences, désirs, and even our emotional states based on our data footprints. This predictive capability allows for the delivery of hyper-personalized content designed to resonate with our unique psychological profiles. Streaming services recommend shows we are likely to enjoy. Shopping platforms suggest products tailored to our tastes. News feeds present articles that align with our interests and beliefs. At first glance, this personalization appears benign, even helpful. But beneath the surface lies a deeper concern: the erosion of serendipity. Serendipity, the chance encounter with unfamiliar ideas, perspectives, and experiences, is essential for intellectual growth and creativity. It challenges our assumptions, broadens our horizons, and fosters empathy. When algorithms curate our reality to reflect our existing preferences, they shield us from the unfamiliar, reinforcing intellectual stagnation and narrowing our worldview. This filter bubble, as coined by internet activist Eli Pariser, creates a digital environment where individuals are insulated from dissenting opinions and alternative perspectives. Over time, this insulation fosters intellectual complacency and ideological rigidity, weakening the foundations of a pluralistic society. Moreover, predictive personalization extends beyond content consumption into the realm of behavioral nudging. Platforms experiment with subtle design choices, color schemes, button placements, timing of prompts to influence user behavior in desired directions. These choice architectures, informed by behavioral economics, exploit cognitive biases to steer decisions without overt coercion. For instance, default settings may encourage users to share more data, accept terms without scrutiny, or engage in monetizable behaviors. The user retains the appearance of choice, but the environment has been engineered to favor specific outcomes. This form of soft paternalism blurs the line between guidance and manipulation, raising profound ethical questions about autonomy and consent. The philosopher Michel Foucault introduced the concept of governmentality, the subtle governance of populations through the shaping of norms, behaviors, and desires. In the digital age, algorithms become instruments of governmentality, not by issuing commands, but by structuring the possibilities within which choices are made. We become governed not by force, but by architecture. This architecture extends into the economic domain through the rise of attention markets. In these markets, human attention is bought and sold to advertisers who leverage personal data to deliver precisely targeted messages. The deeper the platform's understanding of an individual's psychology, the more valuable that individual becomes as a target for persuasion. Advertisers no longer sell products alone, they sell lifestyles, identities, and aspirations, crafting messages that tap into our deepest insecurities and desires. They promise not merely satisfaction, but self-actualization if only we buy the right product, follow the right influencer, adopt the right lifestyle. Consumption becomes not just an economic activity, but a psychological pursuit of meaning and validation. In this context, consumer identity merges with brand identity, blurring the boundaries between personal expression and corporate influence. Brands position themselves as arbiters of values, ethics, and belonging, transforming markets into moral theaters where purchasing decisions signal virtue, status, and tribe affiliation. Yet, this convergence of commerce and identity carries a hidden danger: the commodification of the self. When our identities are shaped by market forces, we risk reducing our intrinsic worth to our roles as consumers, followers, and data points. Authentic selfhood becomes vulnerable to the performative pressures of market validation. The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of bad faith, the denial of one's freedom and responsibility through self-deception and conformity. In the digital marketplace, bad faith manifests as the surrender of authentic identity to the curated performances demanded by algorithms and markets. We become actors in scripts we did not write, performing for audiences we may never see. This crisis of identity extends to our very understanding of reality. As deepfakes, synthetic media, and AI-generated content proliferate, the distinction between genuine and fabricated blurs. Trust, once anchored in shared realities and reliable institutions, becomes increasingly fragile. We enter a post-truth landscape where perception is malleable and certainty elusive. In such a world, the search for epistemic integrity, the commitment to truth-seeking and intellectual honesty, becomes a moral imperative. Yet, the path to integrity is fraught with difficulty, for it requires not only intellectual rigor, but the courage to confront our own biases, to question comforting narratives, and to endure the discomfort of uncertainty. The question before us is not merely how we resist external manipulation, but how we cultivate the inner discipline to remain grounded in truth amidst the storm of persuasion. This is the heart of life mastery in the digital age, a mastery not of technology, but of self. As we step even further into the labyrinth of digital persuasion, we must confront a deeply unsettling realization. Control no longer looks like oppression. It no longer needs chains, prisons, or secret police. Instead, control in the digital era arrives softly, wrapped in convenience, personalization, and choice. It is a velvet cage, one we willingly enter, often with enthusiasm, rarely with awareness. This is the genius and the danger of invisible coercion. Where classical totalitarian regimes relied on censorship, threats, and violence to maintain power, today's digital platform harness our desire, insecurities, and cognitive vulnerabilities to achieve something far more efficient: self-regulation. We become complicit in our own manipulation. We monitor ourselves. We discipline our own thoughts to remain in harmony with the curated narratives fed to us. The German sociologist Max Weber once wrote about the iron cage of rationalization, a system where individuals are trapped within rules and procedures that they themselves have helped to create and maintain. In our era, we witness a new kind of cage, one built not from bureaucracy, but from algorithms. And while Weber's iron cage was cold and bureaucratic, ours is seductive, entertaining, and perpetually rewarding. The algorithms that power Google, Facebook, Amazon, TikTok, and countless others don't simply respond to our choices, they actively shape them. They construct predictive models of our behavior, constantly refining their understanding of who we are, what we want, and what we fear. This is not merely passive reflection, it is active orchestration. Consider how Netflix suggests your next show, or how Spotify builds your weekly playlist. These aren't random suggestions, they're carefully calculated predictions, designed to anticipate and guide your preferences. Over time, they subtly shift your consumption patterns, narrowing your exposure to new experiences, reinforcing existing tastes, and gradually locking you into increasingly predictable patterns of behavior. And it goes deeper. The field of persuasive design deliberately structures user interfaces to exploit psychological triggers, infinite scroll, pull to refresh mechanics, autoplay features. These are not neutral tools. They are intentional mechanisms that hook users into extended engagement loops, leveraging the dopamine systems of the brain. Infinite scroll, for example, removes natural stopping, whereas in older media books, magazines, even early websites, there were natural points where a user would pause, reflect, or disengage. The endless stream removes those pauses, tricking the brain into continuous consumption without self-awareness. This is not unlike gambling addiction, a cycle of variable rewards and uncertain outcomes that fuels compulsive behavior. The default effect is another subtle form of control. People are far more likely to stick with default settings than to actively opt for alternatives. Even when better choices are available, platforms exploit this by setting defaults that maximize data collection, ad exposure, or prolonged engagement. You may have the freedom to opt out, but you are gently nudged not to at every turn. The architecture of digital spaces is designed not to inform or empower, but to capture and prolong attention. And while we tell ourselves that we are making choices freely, the reality is more complicated. We are constantly navigating environments engineered to manipulate our cognitive defaults. What's most alarming is that many of these manipulations remain invisible to us. When control is invisible, it becomes even more effective because it bypasses resistance. It no longer feels like manipulation. It feels like desire, preference, or even freedom. As Aldous Huxley warned in Brave New World, a really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. The architects of today's digital platforms do not call themselves tyrants or oppressors. They speak instead of optimization, engagement, growth, and user experience. Yet the cumulative effect of their systems creates a form of psychological captivity, one that reshapes not only individual lives, but entire societies. We see this clearly in the phenomenon of polarization. The algorithms that optimize for engagement inevitably prioritize content that triggers strong emotional reactions, anger, Outrage, Moral, Indignation. Such emotions keep people online longer, generate more shares, and drive higher ad revenue, but they also fracture social cohesion, turning democratic debate into tribal warfare. Entire populations can now be segmented into micro-tribes, each fed its own version of reality, each radicalized in isolation. This is not accidental. It is the mathematical result of optimizing for engagement. The more extreme the content, the more attention it garners. The more attention it garners, the more extreme the content becomes. Political operatives and interest groups have learned to exploit these dynamics, injecting disinformation, conspiracy theories, and propaganda into the bloodstream of digital media. The platforms, driven by profit, are often slow to respond, reluctant to intervene lest they compromise their own growth engines. What emerges is a world where truth itself becomes fragmented, not through brute censorship, but through overwhelming noise. This is the landscape of epistemic nihilism, where people no longer know what to believe, and trust becomes a scarce resource. The consequences extend far beyond politics. In public health, misinformation spreads faster than scientific consensus. In markets, rumors can trigger economic turbulence. In personal relationships, individuals retreat into isolated information bubbles. Unable to communicate across ideological divides, digital persuasion, then, is not just about selling products or keeping users engaged. It is about the reprogramming of collective consciousness, the reshaping of how societies perceive truth, authority, and reality itself. Even education, once a safeguard against manipulation, has not been spared. Algorithms personalize educational content to such an extent that two students learning the same subject may receive vastly different materials, perspectives, and narratives, all filtered through opaque algorithms optimized for attention, not truth. The philosopher Jürgen Habermas once spoke of the public sphere, a space where citizens come together to debate and deliberate the common good. Digital platforms promise to expand this public sphere into a global commons. Instead, they have fragmented it into countless isolated echo chambers, where debate collapses into confirmation and dialogue into attack. In this splintered reality, the ability to think critically, to hold contradictory ideas, to engage in patient reflection becomes an act of intellectual rebellion. The pursuit of wisdom requires conscious discipline to step back from the algorithmic feeds, to expose oneself to discomforting ideas, to prioritize understanding over outrage. Life mastery in the digital age is not achieved through technological fluency alone. It requires philosophical resilience, the ability to recognize manipulation, to question seductive narratives. To guard the sovereignty of one's own mind becomes the essential virtue of the 21st century. The battle is not against technology itself, but against our uncritical surrender to it. The platforms will not save us. The algorithms will not deliver enlightenment, only deliberate. Conscious human agency can preserve the integrity of thought amidst the storm. As we move even deeper into this intricate web of digital persuasion, it is time to confront an even darker dimension, not just the manipulation of thought, but the systematic exploitation of emotion itself. Because beneath all the algorithms, the design patterns, the predictive engines, there remains one timeless currency that drives all persuasion: human emotion. And those who control the digital sphere have learned to masterfully extract, amplify, and weaponize it. The human mind has always been vulnerable to emotional manipulation, but in previous centuries, such manipulation was often crude, overt, and limited in scale. A charismatic speaker could sway a crowd, a newspaper could stir public sentiment, but the reach was finite, the targeting imprecise. Today, that limitation has vanished. Now, each one of us carries in our pocket a highly personalized emotional manipulation device. Your smartphone does not merely serve you content, it serves your content. Content optimized specifically for your emotional triggers, fears, hopes, biases, and insecurities. This hyper-targeting is not random. It is grounded in massive psychological datasets gathered through your digital footprint, what you like, whom you follow, which articles you linger on, which comments you reply to, which purchases you make, even how long you hesitate before scrolling. Every hesitation, every click, every swipe is logged, analyzed, and incorporated into a constantly evolving model of your emotional landscape. The result is a feedback loop so precise that the platform can often predict your emotional state better than your closest friends, even better than yourself. In 2014, Facebook quietly ran an experiment on nearly 700 point-videoed 0 users, manipulating their news feeds to test whether emotional content could influence mood. The results confirmed what the architects of persuasion already suspected by curating content to be more positive or more negative. They could subtly alter the emotional state of entire populations without their awareness. This was not an isolated experiment. It was a proof of concept. And since that moment, such emotional engineering has only become more sophisticated and more pervasive. One of the most powerful levers is fear. Fear sharpens attention. It primes the brain for vigilance and reaction. It reduces complex thinking and fosters quick, emotional decision-making. For digital platforms optimizing for engagement, fear is a golden trigger. Consider how easily fear-based content spreads conspiracy theories, sensational headlines, stories of danger and threat. These trigger ancient survival mechanisms within us. The amygdala lights up, reasoning is suspended, and impulsive sharing ensues. The algorithm registers the spike in engagement and responds accordingly. More of this content is delivered. The cycle accelerates, but it's not just fear, it's moral outrage as well. Outrage activates not only the self-protective mechanisms of the individual, but the bonding instincts of the tribe. In the digital world, moral outrage becomes social currency. When we denounce, when we attack, when we signal our virtue, we are rewarded with likes, retweets, and followers. The architecture of social media elevates this behavior into a competitive sport, each participant shouting louder into the void for recognition. Jonathan Haidt, the moral psychologist, describes this dynamic as the righteous mind, where individuals are driven more by emotional affiliation with their group than by careful reasoning or empirical truth. In digital spaces, these tribal affiliations harden into ideological fortresses, fortified by algorithmic gatekeepers who feed users a steady diet of confirmation. The most dangerous part of this emotional manipulation is not that it pushes us to feel. Emotions are essential to the human experience. The danger is that it pushes us to feel without thinking. And once critical reasoning has been disarmed, individuals become highly malleable, open to persuasion, to radicalization, to manipulation at scales previously unimaginable. We have seen this dynamic play out in multiple domains. In politics, where divisive campaigns leverage emotional targeting to mobilize or suppress voter groups. In consumer markets, where fear-based marketing persuades individuals to purchase unnecessary goods or subscribe to services that promise safety, status, or belonging. In health and science, where pseudoscience and conspiracy theories spread more virally than peer-reviewed studies, driven by emotional simplicity rather than complexity. In global conflicts, where propaganda weaponizes digital media to inflame hatred, distort truth, and mobilize violence. Each of these cases shares a common thread: emotional manipulation bypassing reason. And while many individuals may believe they are immune, that they are too smart, too informed, too skeptical to be swayed, research consistently shows otherwise. Intelligence offers no blanket immunity to emotional persuasion. In some cases, it even enhances susceptibility through rationalization and motivated reasoning. The cognitive scientist Daniel Kahneman identified two systems of thought. System 1, fast, emotional, and instinctive, and System 2, slow, deliberate, and analytical. Digital persuasion overwhelmingly targets System 1, the impulsive, emotional brain that reacts in milliseconds. And because System 1 requires less effort, it dominates our digital interactions. The tragedy is that while our biology has remained relatively unchanged for tens of thousands of years, the environment in which our emotions operate has been radically transformed in just 2 decades. We are equipped with Paleolithic emotional hardware operating in a hyper-modern informational ecosystem, one designed to exploit every vulnerability in that hardware. In this sense, we are witnessing not just a technological revolution, but an evolutionary mismatch. The digital environment is not neutral. It is a predatory landscape, one that preys upon our deepest instincts for belonging, certainty, and status. Philosophically, this challenges the very concept of free will. Are we truly making autonomous decisions if our emotional states are being constantly manipulated? If every opinion we form, every purchase we make, every belief we adopt has been influenced by unseen algorithms designed to push us toward predictable outcomes, can we still call ourselves free agents? The Stoics, more than 2,000 years ago, wrestled with a parallel dilemma. Their solution was self-mastery, the disciplined control of one's emotions through reason, reflection, and virtue. In the digital era, their wisdom rings more urgently than ever. Without self-mastery, we become puppets of forces we cannot see. With it, we reclaim sovereignty over our emotional and intellectual life. But this battle for self-mastery must be fought daily, because the assault on our emotions is constant. Every notification, every trending topic, every viral post is a test of our capacity to pause, reflect, and resist automatic reaction. The greatest victory of digital persuasion is not that it deceives us. The greatest victory is that it exhausts us. When every moment is an emotional trigger, when every headline demands outrage, when every debate requires total allegiance, we become weary. And in that exhaustion, we surrender our critical faculties simply to survive the next onslaught. It is in this state of exhaustion that the architects of digital persuasion achieve their ultimate goal, not simply to control what we think, but to control whether we think at all. As we approach the deeper core of digital persuasion, we encounter one of its most insidious elements, normalization. Not merely the act of manipulating individuals, but the quiet, gradual redefinition of what society considers acceptable, even inevitable. The architects of digital systems do not need to impose their vision by force. They simply need to condition us to believe that their systems are natural, unavoidable, and part of the way the world must function. This is where persuasion transcends individual behavior and penetrates culture itself. Over time, we stop questioning the very architecture of the digital landscape. We adapt to its rules, its values, and its rhythm, the speed, the immediacy, the emotional volatility, all become normalized. And with normalization comes a dangerous loss, the loss of perspective. The philosopher Antonio Gramsci called this the cultural hegemony, the dominance of certain norms, ideas, and worldviews that become so deeply ingrained in the social fabric that they no longer appear as one option among many, but as the only conceivable reality. In the context of digital persuasion, cultural hegemony emerges through the silent conquest of attention, convenience, and economic dependence. Take, for example, the expectation of constant availability, the notion that one must be reachable at any moment, that responses should be immediate, that life should unfold at the tempo of notifications. This is not a timeless human norm. It is a manufactured expectation, one constructed by the needs of platforms that monetize engagement. Yet today, if one chooses to disengage, to not check emails on weekends, to turn off notifications, to leave messages unanswered for hours, they are often perceived as irresponsible, inefficient, or even rude. The human nervous system was not designed for this level of perpetual engagement, but the culture of digital immediacy demands it nonetheless. Similarly, consider the valorization of visibility. In a digital world governed by metrics, visibility becomes a proxy for value. The more followers you have, the more likes you accumulate, the higher your perceived worth. Success is no longer measured solely by achievement or character, but by algorithmic popularity. Influencers, once an obscure niche, have become cultural icons. Their livelihoods and identities are built upon constant performance for the algorithm. Their images are polished, their narratives carefully curated to sustain engagement, and as these figures rise to prominence, they become aspirational models, normalizing a performative existence where one's private life is increasingly converted into public spectacle. This normalization infects even personal relationships. The quantification of intimacy, measuring friendships by streak, counts, likes, or visible interactions, subtly shifts the meaning of human connection. Relationships that were once grounded in shared presence and private trust become increasingly mediated by public validation. Over time, this produces what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the society of transparency, a culture where everything must be seen, documented, shared, and consumed. Privacy, contemplation, and interiority lose their value. Authenticity becomes performative. Silence becomes suspicious. This is no accident. The digital platforms thrive when every aspect of life becomes content, every meal photographed, every thought tweeted, every experience live streamed all become raw material for the attention economy. The more visible we are, the more data we generate, and the more data we generate, the more precise the mechanisms of persuasion become. But while this normalization serves the interests of platforms, it quietly erodes the foundations of individual freedom. When self-worth becomes tethered to digital visibility, individuals become increasingly malleable. We begin to tailor not only what we share, but who we are, reshaping our personalities, values, and aspirations to fit the expectations of the system. The danger here is profound. When the architecture of persuasion becomes invisible, when its norms become synonymous with reality itself, resistance becomes almost unthinkable. We no longer feel manipulated because we have forgotten what unmanipulated life looks like. This creeping captivity extends to our understanding of knowledge itself. In a world dominated by real-time feeds, breaking news alerts, and viral headlines, knowledge becomes fragmented, shallow, and ephemeral. Long-form thinking, slow reading, and deep study are increasingly marginalized. We see this even in education, where attention spans, shorten, and curricula are adapted to engage students rather than challenge them. The reward structures of digital life prioritize fast consumption over patient mastery. The very skills necessary for critical thinking, reflection, patience, intellectual humility are atrophied by a system that rewards impulsivity. In such an environment, ignorance does not manifest as a lack of information. On the contrary, we are drowning in information. Rather, ignorance becomes the inability to process, prioritize, and synthesize information meaningfully. It is a crisis of wisdom, not data. This is where digital persuasion evolves from mere influence into systemic epistemic control, not by restricting access to information, but by overwhelming it, fragmenting it, and eroding our ability to discern its value. The result is a society that mistakes information consumption for understanding, scrolling for learning, reaction for thinking. Nietzsche's warning echoes here. He who cannot obey himself will be commanded. When individuals lose the capacity for self-governance, for intellectual and emotional discipline, they become vulnerable to those who would command them through invisible strings. And this brings us to perhaps the most chilling dimension of digital persuasion: predictive governance. As machine learning models grow more sophisticated, platforms and institutions move from reactive persuasion to proactive shaping of behavior. They no longer wait for us to express preferences, they begin to anticipate them, subtly nudging us toward outcomes before we are even aware of our own inclinations. This predictive capability is marketed as convenience, anticipating your next purchase, suggesting your next trip, reminding you of appointments. But in the hands of those with political or economic agendas, it becomes a form of anticipatory control, shaping not only what we do but who we become. When a system can predict your next move with high accuracy, the boundary between suggestion and decision collapses. Your choices are still technically voluntary, but they have been so thoroughly preconditioned that true autonomy becomes a mathematical illusion. The ancient Stoics spoke of prohairesis, the capacity for rational choice, the ability to govern one's internal world regardless of external forces. In the face of digital persuasion, this inner citadel is under relentless siege. To defend it requires not only awareness of external manipulation, but mastery over one's own instincts, emotions, and desires, because ultimately, digital persuasion does not win by force. It wins by exhaustion. Habituation. and normalization. It makes surrender feel natural. It makes captivity feel like freedom. And if we fail to recognize this quiet conquest, the chains will not rattle. They will softly tighten, link by link, until freedom itself becomes a memory we struggle to fully recall. At the end of this long descent into the architecture of digital persuasion, we stand at the threshold of a sobering truth, one that is neither entirely pessimistic nor entirely hopeful. But brutally honest, we are living through a great psychological revolution. A war for the sovereignty of human consciousness. A war waged not with bullets or armies, but with algorithms, data, and the careful engineering of desire. This revolution is silent. There are no grand declarations, no marching armies, no dramatic usurpations of power. Instead, it unfolds inside the most sacred territory that has ever existed, the individual mind. And yet, we have allowed much of this invasion, not because we are weak, but because the very nature of our psychology was always susceptible to such seduction. What we face today is not entirely new. Ancient philosophers, prophets, and sages have warned about these vulnerabilities for millennia, about the perils of pride, the thirst for validation, the comfort of conformity, and the addictive pursuit of pleasure. What is new is the scale, the speed, the precision, the sophistication. We are no longer dealing with isolated charlatans who prey on the gullible. We are dealing with industrialized persuasion engines, billion-dollar machines, trained on oceans of personal data, fueled by market incentives that reward not wisdom, not truth, not enlightenment, but engagement. The more we engage, the more we reveal ourselves. The more we reveal, the more predictable we become. The more predictable we become, the easier we are to manipulate. It is a cycle of willing vulnerability, compounded daily, often without resistance. But there is still a frontier that remains untouched, or at least not yet fully conquered: intentional consciousness. The part of us that can step back, observe, and reflect. The part that can ask, why am I clicking? Why am I sharing? Why am I outraged? The part that can see the system for what it is, even as it operates. This is where the battle must now move, not against the platforms themselves, but within each of us. Because the truth is, both terrifying and liberating, the system cannot force us to surrender our minds. It can only tempt, nudge, and exhaust. The final decision to abdicate our autonomy always rests with us. The practice of cognitive vigilance, of deliberately slowing one's reactions, interrogating one's emotions, examining the sources of one's beliefs, becomes not merely a useful habit, but a survival skill for the digital age. Philosophically, this brings us back to the wisdom of ancient disciplines: Stoicism, Buddhism, Taoism, systems of thought that recognized long before algorithms existed that the most dangerous threats to freedom are not external tyrants, but the internal chains of compulsion, craving, and self-deception. The Stoics taught that while we cannot always control external circumstances, we can control our responses. In today's digital landscape, this means controlling when we engage, how we consume information, whom we trust, and most importantly, when we step away. Digital minimalism, deep work, information fasting, these are not passing fads. They are adaptive responses to a hostile information environment. They are forms of psychological hygiene necessary to preserve the clarity of thought and emotional stability that persuasion systems are designed to erode. But individual mastery, while essential, will not be sufficient on its own. There is also a collective frontier to address a moral responsibility to redefine the ethical foundations of digital architecture itself. The architects of digital persuasion platform designers, algorithm engineers. Data scientists are not inherently evil. Many began their work with utopian ideals to connect humanity, democratize knowledge, empower the voiceless. But good intentions have collided with brutal incentives that reward attention over accuracy, outrage over dialogue, emotional reactivity over intellectual depth, growth over wisdom. To reverse this, we need a new ethical framework, a digital humanism that prioritizes dignity over data extraction, that designs algorithms not to exploit weaknesses, but to support flourishing. That recognizes that human freedom is not found in endless choice, but in meaningful autonomy. Policymakers, too, must rise to the challenge. The problem of digital persuasion is not one that markets alone can regulate. Transparency laws, algorithmic audits, data ownership rights, ethical design standards, these are not distant academic discussions. They are the necessary scaffolding for any society that hopes to preserve freedom in the age of automated influence, because if we do not build this scaffolding, others will build something else. Authoritarian regimes have already recognized the power of digital persuasion for surveillance, control, and thought management on scales unimaginable even a generation ago. China's social credit system, state-sponsored troll farms, AI-powered censorship. These are not science fiction warnings. They are living experiments in total information governance, experiments that may soon be exported far beyond their borders if we do not present an alternative model. And yet, amidst this dark horizon, there is also an extraordinary opportunity. Never before in history has so much knowledge been so widely accessible. Never before has an individual had the tools to educate themselves, to connect across boundaries, to amplify marginalized voices, to create art, to build movements all from a simple device in their hand. The same technologies that enable manipulation also contain the seeds of awakening if we learn to wield them with wisdom rather than compulsion. We must not abandon technology. That would be neither realistic nor desirable. Instead, we must tame it, reclaim authorship of our relationship to it, resist becoming mere passengers on the algorithmic ride, because ultimately, persuasion becomes most dangerous when it is unconscious. The simple act of awareness, I am being nudged, I am being triggered, I am being sold, is itself a form of rebellion. In this sense, the battle for the soul of the digital age will not be won by technocrats, regulators, or even the platforms themselves. It will be won or lost in the daily, silent choices of ordinary individuals, choices about what we consume, how we react, where we place our trust, whether we choose reflex or reflection. The future of freedom is not guaranteed. It never was. But it is still ours to defend, and it begins, always, behind the curtain in the quiet theatre of the human mind, where persuasion whispers, but where sovereignty still waits to be claimed.